Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here. A word of thanks also goes to CG, the Center for International Governance Innovation, for supporting me in my research. And while I've always been interested in issues at the intersection of culture and the law, now I'm particularly looking into the concept of cultural appropriation. Now, some of you may have already heard about cultural appropriation, and you don't need to look much further than the pages of fashion magazines or fashion blogs or even the windows of many stores to see that there is what we call an indigenous, ethnic, or folkloric trend. And as a matter of fact, the current issue of the Polish Vogue currently displays a model flanked by some girls wearing traditional costume. And it's just another manifest example of the long love story between fashion and folklore. And all the brands that you see appearing on the screen have been partaking in this trend. I'll wait for the picture to appear. But there's just one picture that I would all like to ponder upon, and I'd like to ask you, what does this picture evoke for you? You might say it's stylish, it's hip, it's Pharrell Williams, so it must be cool. It's colorful, it's playful, it's beautiful. In fact, what if I were to tell you that this is actually very offensive to many Native American indigenous people, and that they can suffer great harm when use of their cultural elements is done in fashion, which strips the cultural elements from their spiritual significance? So the main message of my presentation is that the use of cultural elements in fashion can cause harm to their owners. And you might say, well, wait a minute. There are two sides to this debate, right? Fashion needs to take its inspiration from somewhere. And the diversity of cultural influences is what will make fashion evolve and thrive. So how can we tell what is appropriation and what is inspiration? What is acceptable and what is offensive? How do we draw the line between what is right and wrong? Well, perhaps by first looking at what a definition of cultural appropriation is. It is the act of taking a cultural element, or what we call a TCE, which stands for Traditional Cultural Expression, from a source community, repurposing it in a different culture, and of course without permission or acknowledgement from that source culture. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see a Guatemalan woman wearing a traditional embroidered blouse called a huipil. And a similar kind of huipil from Mexico was used by a French designer by the name of Isabelle Marant, who was accused of cultural appropriation and caused quite a stir in France. On this picture, you see two women from the Basotho nation in the southern African country of Lesotho wearing traditional blankets. And similar blankets were made and commercialized by the French fashion house Louis Vuitton in its men's collection a couple of years ago. So cultural appropriation is often characterized by a power imbalance. There's always a form of inequality between the taker and the one that's being taken, some form of dominance, often in the context of colonization. There's also, as I've mentioned, a change of cultural context. And if you recall the picture of the Indian feathered headdress that we saw, there's often a loss of meaning from that change of cultural context, and that may cause harm. There's an absence of community input, so the community that is at the origin of the cultural element did not give its consent, did not give its authorization, did not collaborate in any way. And although this is not a necessary condition, there's often a commercial nature of the use. So I was interested to see why is there cultural appropriation, and I've been able to identify 3 causes. First, it's the appeal of the aesthetics of indigenous design, but I want to add not just the aesthetics, but also the values that they convey. It may convey authenticity, uniqueness, because it's handmade, it might be more respectful of the environment, and all this has a role to play. There's also, and I think this is central to the topic of our conference, a lack of protection for indigenous cultural elements, or TCEs. Because they've been handed down through the generations for many, many centuries, sometimes they fail to meet the originality criterion for protectability. So copyright does not provide protection to traditional cultural expression, or if they do, in a very limited way. And lastly, it's the blurriness about what it means to appropriate that creates just the perfect breeding ground for it to happen. The concept is in this gray zone where we don't really know where to draw the line. And many people who have been accused of cultural appropriation will say, well, I wasn't aware, I didn't realize, I was ignorant. Be that as it may, the consequences can be drastic. Culturally, it's an attack on the cultural integrity of the owners of cultures. On a socio-political level, it's also an attack on the loss of identity, and is experienced often as another form of domination or exploitation or even colonization. And at the economic level, of course, they do not participate in the economic benefits of the fashion creations, might lose on that aspect, but also they might be deprived of the sales of their genuine, authentic products. And we're not talking insignificant numbers. The Maasai, which is an indigenous people living in Tanzania and Kenya, claims that its brand is valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're not talking peanuts here. But I want to stress a little caveat, is that, of course, we all agree that there are benefits to cultural exchange and cultural interactions, and culture is by definition fluid, so to restrain its flows would be to negate its very essence. And I'd like to quote here an indigenous fashion designer from the United States, Bethany Yellowtail, who says, and I quote, for me, my mission is not to combat cultural appropriation, end quote. And indeed, it would be waging a losing battle. So what I've tried to do is come up with principles that would help anyone wanting to use cultural elements to do it appropriately instead of appropriating them. And the first principle is understanding and respect. So recall that they're not in the public domain, they're not raw material for anyone to take, and ask yourself, well, where does it come from? Who does it belong to? What does it mean to them? And how can I use it in a way that won't cause harm? Also engage in transformation and not replication. Do not recycle old stereotypes, but engage in transformative inspiration. Give it a new spin, and always with respect, of course. Acknowledge and attribute, and in the case of Isabelle Marant, she failed to attribute the Mexican community that had been her inspiration for the huipil dress. And also get involved with the community, collaborate with it. There are many examples of win-win partnerships, and there are too many actually to mention, but Carla Fernandez from Mexico has entered a deal with the artisans working with her where they own the intellectual property in their creations. So to answer my initial question, is copyright the answer? Well, the short answer is no, not really, because TCEs do not meet the originality threshold, they are not protected by copyright. However, copyright law could be adapted, as it has been many times in its history, based on the key principles I've just mentioned to you, notably acknowledgement and attribution. I think there's a perfect role for moral rights here to apply to TCEs. So more generally, what can be done? Well, I think that we need to address the blurriness around the concept. So raising awareness about it, what it really means, could already be a first step. Then I think that indigenous fashion designers could receive capacity building because they need to be also genuine players in the fashion industry. And I think there's also a case for normative reform. There are many initiatives taking place, but let me just mention the WIPO IGC, which is the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property, Folklore, Traditional Knowledge, and Genetic Resources, which is currently holding negotiations to come up with a new international instrument to protect traditional cultural expressions, among others. So just to conclude very briefly, TCEs are not just aesthetic or ornamental, but they're part of the identity of their holders. And for the holders to have control over their culture is control over their identity, and enables them to determine how they want to live their lives free from exploitation and external domination. And I think that this can be achieved with a little bit of help from copyright. Thank you.